Okay, so let's talk about the meaning and the symbolism in the Masque of the Red Death. Um, this is different from a lot of other stories that Poe wrote, in that there's um, a lot of symbolism. There's symbolism in a lot of what Poe wrote, but not as much like in detail as it is here. Okay, so much so that this is there's symbolism in his poem The Raven. There's some in Telltale Heart, but in reality, this is the one that he uses a lot of it. So if you remember the story, if you haven't watched the other video, you should watch it, or if you've read the story, you know what's in it. So they seal themselves up, right, just to stay away from this, to keep away from this Red Death that's ravaging the country, it's killing people. And Prince Prospero brings all of his friends in to be protected. And then you have the rooms that they were partying in. Okay, so it was an imperial suite which has 7 rooms. Okay, and each one has a color. And you remember the way that the rooms were set up. They weren't in a straight line or a straight vista, as it says, okay, where you can see from one room into the next to the last one, from the first to the last. They were at such a weird angle that you couldn't see into the next room. They go from east to west, okay, and that's all symbolic. Okay, first of all, the number 7. 7 is often considered a magical number, a special number. Shakespeare, in one of his plays, wrote called a speech called "The 7 Ages of Man." 7 times parts of your life that you're in. Okay, so 7 is somewhat of a symbolic, magical number. 7 days in a week. Okay, and so now it comes to the rooms and the actual colors. Okay, so the first one is blue, which is symbolic of life and birth. Okay, with me? And then second is purple, so it's a royal color. All right, so birth, childhood. The third is green, which represents, again, growth and life. You think about green things. Okay, during summer, grass and plants, and spring and all that green comes back. Okay, so green. All right. The fourth was furnished with orange. Okay, orange represents harvest. Think about Halloween, October. You have orange, right? So orange represents the harvest, when people would bring their crops in. Okay, so again, that's life. So growth. Orange is sort of the prime of your life. Okay, then comes white, which makes sense, right? You get gray hair, white haired as you get older. And the sixth with violet, which is a dark purple color. So it's sort of like as the sun goes down, right? And it's sort of toward the end of your life. And then the last one is black, which represents death. So you have 7 rooms representing the 7 ages of man, and each color represents a different part of your life. And at the end, you have black, which is death, and you have the clock, the ebony clock, right? So it's symbolic of the passage of time. And so as the clock hits the hour, all the revelers would stop, right? The partygoers would stop and look at what's going on. It's very similar to life when things happen and you stop and go, man, was it that long ago that I did this? Or and as adults, you start thinking back, well, oh gosh, that was 20 years ago. Felt like it was just happened yesterday. And so you have that passage of time. Okay. Now remember that the only difference between the rooms, the panes of glass were actually the same color as the room, except for the last one, which is red, which is scarlet, and that's symbolic of blood. And it makes sense when you think about the story with the Red Death coming in, right? Okay. And so you have the clock, and then I'm trying to go through the story here to make sure I get everything. And the passage of time, 60 minutes per hour. And the people represent just people in general. The whole idea of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. That sort of life thing. I don't have a care in the world. I've got food. I've got drink. I've got friends. I've got all these desires, fleshy desires. Nothing really spiritual here or meaningful. So they're just having a really good time until we get to the hour of 12, right? And that's when the actual figure shows up. Okay, so 12 is symbolic. So you think about the hour, it's the top of the hour, right? It comes back around and bang, midnight. Midnight has all kinds of symbolic meaning throughout different cultures. In American culture, you think about, my parents used to tell me nothing good happens after midnight. So you think about midnight when monsters come out, that kind of stuff. So at midnight in this case just means the end of life, because literally it was for these people. The, um, the figure was dressed by what they just exactly like someone they were actually trying to avoid, and so he comes in and no one will touch him. We talked about in the other video about he out-Heroded Herod. Talked about who Herod was and how that relates to this, how terrible this figure was for dressing this way. Okay, and it was he looked so much like one that they thought, man, this is a great costume. I can't even. It just seems like that's real. So they start, of course, when Prince Prospero says, we seize him, we're going to hang this guy. No one would put their hand out. No one would grab this guy. And he started in the eastern chamber and went through all the rooms, passed by everybody, finally to the seventh chamber. So also something about the rooms, two other things here brings to mind. It goes the east. You have the blue room in the east and the black room in the west. Well, which way does the sun come up in the east? It comes up in the east, and then it goes down in the west because of the way the earth turns. Okay, so there you go. So from east to west, the passage of time. Also, remember, the rooms were at odd angles, so you couldn't see into the next room until you went in there, and that's exactly like life, right? You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You don't know what's going to happen a week from now. You don't know if you're going to have a year from now. You have an idea, but you don't know, and that's what Poe was getting at. Like, life is capricious. Sometimes things just happen. Okay, sometimes good, sometimes bad. You might, some bad things happen sometimes. You might go into somebody goes into a convenience store and just buys a $2 scratch off and ends up winning $50,000. You just never know. Okay, so it's good and bad. All right. So again, east to west, you can't see in the next room, you can't see life. Now, Prince Prospero goes after this guy because he was upset with his momentary cowardice, is being afraid. He goes after him, and when he gets there, he sees what it is, and he just dies. Okay, the people grab at him and pull off. Of course, in the story, they pull off the gown and the mask, and there's nothing there. It's untenanted by any tangible form. So this thing was actually the Red Death, because it says, and now is acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He come like a thief in the night. So the Bible talks about a thief in the night, that for Christians, Jesus will come back like a thief in the night. You don't know when he's going to come back. Okay, so he's there, boom, and he gets them all. And they all die in a very horrible way. But it's interesting that Prince Prospero, think about his name, it's symbolic. Prince Prospero, he prospers. It's something good. If your business prospers, that means it's doing really well, right? Well, Prince Prospero doesn't really prosper here, does he? What is Poe getting at here? What is the theme of this story? A lot of critics, and I agree with a lot of people. I mean, I've read this throughout my time teaching and also taking American literature courses in college and in school. And I've always believed that what Poe is saying here is the theme is, again, theme is not the moral of the story. I don't like when people say that. Morals of stories only come basically from one thing, and that's typically from fables or parables. Theme is simply a general statement that the author's making about humans or humanity or life in general. And here what Poe is saying, the theme of it would be very simple. You can't escape death. Death is going to come for you. You can't get away from it. Hopefully later than sooner, right? But you really can't escape it. And no matter what you do, no matter how much money you have, how big your house is, if you've got a giant wall up around it, in this case, you can't escape it, and that's what Poe's getting at. So the Red Death comes and gets them. Now, in a historical context, this is an interesting story because many critics and Poe scholars believe that the Red Death here in this case is actually tuberculosis. And if you remember going back to our discussions about Poe's life, he lost his mother to tuberculosis. He lost his foster mother, Frances Allen, to tuberculosis. He'd eventually lose his own wife, Virginia, to the same disease, tuberculosis. And being a lung disease, the very end of the disease caused you to cough up blood. Nowadays, guys, we have vaccinations against what's called TB, tuberculosis. In those days, they called it tuberculosis. They mostly called it consumption because it would basically consume you. And it was terrible. And the only real treatment they had for it was for you to travel out west to where the air is drier, like in Colorado and Utah and Arizona. It would actually help you live longer. A dry climate would help you, but there was no cure for it. But for Poe, the Red Death was consumption. It was tuberculosis, and you couldn't escape from it because once you got it, that's it. So it's interesting that many critics have said that maybe he meant that he wrote the story as a way of dealing with expressing his frustration, his anger sometimes, or his deeper feelings in regard to losing his family. Great story, very symbolic, something really gives you something to think about. So I've always enjoyed it. It's one of my favorites of Poe's, and favorites in general, but probably my favorite of Edgar Allan Poe. So if you have any questions, you can leave it down in the comments, and we'll try to answer those for you. All right.